Hello, everyone. This is the Engineering Politics Podcast. I want to start out by saying I hope you're all safe out there. We are living in strange times, and the passions of the masses are amplified like we've never seen them before. Social media is filled with more morally bankrupt and dishonest character attacks than we normally see, and that's saying a lot. But in an effort to give an opinion that is less vile and divisive than most of the opinions we've seen in the past couple of weeks, I wanted to give my feedback on some possible solutions that might help fix the situation we're in today. I wrote a current events piece titled Finding a Path Towards Justice, in which I gave my opinion on the George Floyd incident and the riots that followed. But even though my piece and this podcast will ultimately be about the changes we want to make to avoid incidents like these, the unfortunate reality about our social culture today is we love to claim outrage and demand action, but we aren't so good at defining that action. What I want to focus on in this podcast is what changes we can make to law enforcement processes to incentivize better behavior, or at least disincentivize bad behavior. What I don't want to talk about in much detail is what high crime or poverty-stricken communities can do to better their situation. This goes for communities of all colors, and I'll save that for a later time. One thing is clear. We can't rely on reforms to be made to just one side of this issue. If we want to make sustainable changes to our culture, it'll take a group effort. Before I move on to the main part of the show, I want to thank you for listening and reading my work. None of this is possible or would be happening if I didn't have the support of my listeners and the people who read the content on engineeringpolitics.com. But I want to make sure you are all aware, if you aren't already, that I'm trying to build a community. In this community, you can get all of my content as soon as it's published, and you can talk to me directly and others in the community. My community can be found at engineeringpolitics.locals.com. You can become a member of this community by going to that address and creating a username and password. The great thing about this community is it's completely free. And now I have an offer for current and future members. I'm offering a 3-month trial of the subscriber membership. All you need to do is enter the promo code EPFREE, that is EPFREE. You can use the subscription to get more features and extra content, and you will eventually unlock subscriber-only content in the future. After the trial runs out, you can become a regular subscriber starting at $2 per month. I would ask that you consider supporting this content via the Engineering Politics Locals community, so this content can remain independent and pick up a larger following. I do plan on collaborating with other creators in the future on this podcast, and the larger the following, the more creators will come on the podcast. I appreciate you sharing this content with others, and I hope you consider supporting if you aren't already. The only way we can build a community is by building it together. Well, that's it for now. Let's get the show started. You're listening to the Engineering Politics Podcast. We have been in uncertain times for a while now. With the invisible threat of the coronavirus pandemic forcing people into their homes, we're all on edge and ready to get out. But just as the tense feeling in the air began to loosen and the states and businesses started to reopen, tragedy in its most disgusting form emerged via video of a police officer kneeling on the back of the neck of a handcuffed suspect that would lead to his death. Video of the incident was taken while the officer knelt on the back of George Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, the last few minutes of which Floyd was already visibly unconscious, yet the officer didn't yield. Floyd was pleading for his life, as well as the onlookers asking the officer to get off of his neck. Video is still available, but I warn you, it's very difficult to watch. In this podcast, I would like to go over a few different ways we can avoid situations like this in the future. But first, I will give my take on the incident given the information we know so far. George Floyd was killed on May 25, 2020 by Officer Derek Chauvin in Minneapolis, Minnesota. The possible intentions of the officer have not yet been revealed, and conflicting details have emerged about all the contributing factors that ultimately led to Floyd's death. But I don't think those details are relevant, and I'm not going to speculate on those topics during this podcast. Floyd was a 46-year-old African-American man, and Chauvin was a 44-year-old white man. This incident is held up as another example of police brutality against black people in America. Now, We can argue the real numbers on this topic and if black people are disproportionately targeted by the police, but I won't be doing that here. There's no reason other than the uncomfortable visual to believe this act was driven by racism, but quite honestly, like I said before, I don't think that's completely relevant in the end. I'm fairly confident with the given information that has come out so far, I can justifiably call this a killing of another human being and not just an accident. Chauvin has been fired by the Minneapolis Police Department and arrested for the death of George Floyd on charges of third-degree murder and second-degree manslaughter. This has caused social media to erupt with posts claiming that the treatment of black Americans has not gotten much better since the days of Martin Luther King Jr. This is not a claim I agree with and is not supported by empirical evidence, but I do understand why people feel this way. Protests immediately began to pop up in all major cities and black communities around the country. Protests have largely been peaceful during the day, but then devolve into violent riots at night, destroying property, looting local businesses, flipping cop cars, and causing severe injury to several people, including the death of a retired St. Louis police captain David Dorn, who was just trying to prevent a pawn shop from being looted. The adoption of mask wearing during the pandemic has made it much easier to riot while maintaining anonymity. I want to get some things clear before I get to the meat of this piece. I condemn the vile act by this officer that led to the death of Mr. Floyd. I show no sympathy for this officer, the officers who stood by and let it happen, and anyone who believes in racism as an acceptable ideology or belief in modern society. I also condemn the rioters and the people destroying and looting property. The right to protest is one of the most sacred rights that makes America the greatest country in the world, and I support anyone who feels the need to protest to be heard, even if I don't agree with everything they are protesting for. The violent rioters and looters make up a very small percentage of these protests and therefore shouldn't reflect poorly on the protests as a whole. But just as I give the protesters the benefit of the doubt, I do the same for the police force. A few bad police officers shouldn't sully the names or reflect poorly on hundreds of thousands of police officers serving their communities faithfully. There seems to be no room for this kind of condemnation of both bad acts on social media currently, which is adding fuel to the fire of outrage. But I assure you, these two things can be true at once. Ignorant violence should be condemned no matter the skin color of the people perpetrating that violence. Whether or not you believe there is a systematic problem inherent within the police department and the law enforcement community more generally, we should find solutions to help decrease the number of bad actions by law enforcement to as close to zero as possible. The unfortunate reality of this solution is, as long as there's a human behind the badge, bad things will always happen. What we should ask ourselves is, how do we incentivize better behavior or disincentivize bad behavior to avoid tragedies like this in the future? There are a couple methods local governments or communities can implement that will help resolve this issue, but not all proposed solutions are popular with all people. For example, solutions that involve improving the social health of many high-crime or poor communities often are rejected as racist implications if that community happens to be a majority black. Finding ways to keep fathers in the home, discourage criminal behavior so new businesses will come into the community and create jobs, and providing children with the best opportunity for high-quality education are ways to improve the health of all high-crime or poor communities. Whether these communities are a majority white, black, or any other color, these three factors contribute heavily to the health of that community. But this idea is seen as racist depending on the skin color most prevalent in that community. And as I've explained in many articles and podcasts before, the conflation of race and culture is why we have this mental roadblock. There is no reason to believe there is a genetic racial component that leads to this type of poverty and crime. Race or skin color is not the reason these communities struggle. What we should be discussing is the cultural and sometimes political characteristics that lead to bad behavior and worse outcomes. If the culture at large of a community doesn't find it important to raise children with both parents, prioritize education, and teach respect for everyone else in that community, the social and economic outcomes for that community will suffer. This isn't to say one culture is all good and another is all bad, but we must recognize bad behavior incentivized by culture so we can change course and improve that culture. There's no direct link between race and culture, so we must be able to separate the two and have an honest discussion or nothing will change. For the sake of this argument, I'll leave out the culture component as much as I can just to focus on what changes we can make to law enforcement practices that will improve their relationships with their communities. There are a few simple methods that are always given by the talking heads on cable news that do work when implemented properly. I'm talking about methods like building a better relationship between the local law enforcement and the community, hire police officers from within the community so they understand how to best enforce the law, and mandate operational body cameras on officers to increase accountability. All of these methods work when implemented, but we can't just stop there. We must adopt other methods in conjunction with the three I just mentioned to increase the effectiveness of those changes. An additional method we must adopt is an increase in police presence to decrease crime and incentivize new business to come in. An increase in police presence combined with a better relationship between local law enforcement and the community will result in less crime. The concern coming from the people opposing an increase in police presence is it will just increase racial tensions due to the systematic racism inherent in law enforcement. But better community relations should decrease the chances of bad behavior. We see when police are not present or disincentivized to police diligently, crime goes up. In an interview by Vox with Heather McDonald, McDonald highlights something called the Ferguson effect. This is the idea that police officers are afraid to police effectively because they might be caught in a situation where they must take lawful action that leads to the injury or death of a person of color. This idea was named after the Ferguson protests after the death of Michael Brown in 2014. The officer who shot Brown was accused of racism and murder of an unarmed black man, which led to the protests and elevated the Black Lives Matter movement. President Obama's Department of Justice later found in an investigation the officer who shot Brown acted in lawful self-defense after Brown assaulted the officer and tried to take his gun. McDonald argues the Ferguson effect led to a sharp increase in crime, specifically murder, around the nation. McDonald supports this argument with empirical evidence in her book, The War on Cops. The idea here being, if we increase police presence with a strong relationship with the community, law enforcement will be able to do their job confidently and effectively to reduce crime. The next method we should investigate to decrease police brutality is decreasing the power of police unions. This is a hard pill to swallow for many who advocate for public sector unions like the teachers' unions. In my opinion, not only are public sector unions a bad idea, the whole Department of Education should be considered unconstitutional. Teachers' unions protect bad teachers, fight educational innovation, and prioritize job stability over educating children. Unions are groups of workers collectively bargaining for better pay, benefits, and work conditions with their employer. In this case of teachers' unions bargaining with the public school system, the union uses public dollars to bargain for more public dollars. Effectively, it's the government bargaining with the government on behalf of the government. We should all see why this is a problem, and police unions aren't much different. Police officers rely heavily on police union contracts to shield themselves from liability when on the job. We can't really blame police officers for requesting some sort of protection due to the high-risk situations they find themselves in every day, but we can't remove accountability that increases the chances of police misconduct. A piece put together by Jonathan H. Adler from Reason titled Police Unions and the Problem with Police Misconduct goes over the role police unions play in police misconduct with several links to various source material. Adler's article also touches a bit on the final method useful in decreasing the rate of police brutality. The final method is completely different from the other methods reviewed in this podcast because it involves legal protection in court for bad action. This method will require the abolition or revision of the qualified immunity doctrine. Qualified immunity, as defined by the Cato Institute, is a judicial doctrine developed by the Supreme Court in the late 1960s which shields state actors from liability for their misconduct even when they break the law. The qualified immunity doctrine is a defense available to all government officials, including law enforcement, to act as a shield to protect them from legal action when violating the law that isn't clearly established. And yes, you did hear that confusing sentence correctly. The Cato Institute does a good job at explaining why the qualified immunity doctrine is an unlawful shield for public officials by denying accountability. Basically, if a police officer were to violate someone's constitutional rights and be taken to court, the officer's defense can argue qualified immunity and state there has been no prior cases litigated with sufficiently similar facts that violated a clearly established law. This makes it relatively easy to escape accountability for violating someone's rights if you're a police officer or other public official. There is large bipartisan support, which is hard to come by nowadays, to change or eliminate the qualified immunity doctrine. Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas stated his position in 2017, writing, Because our analysis is no longer grounded in the common law backdrop against which Congress enacted the 1871 Act, we are no longer engaged in interpreting the intent of Congress in enacting the Act. Justice Thomas continued, "Our qualified immunity precedents instead represent precisely the sort of freewheeling policy choices that we have previously disclaimed the power to make." Justice Thomas's complete statement can be found in an article in the Washington Post titled, "In an appropriate case, we should reconsider our qualified immunity jurisprudence." Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor expressed similar concerns about this doctrine's protection of police misconduct. And crazy enough, as I was writing this piece on this topic, a new bill was just introduced by Congressman Justin Amash called the End Qualified Immunity Act. More details can be found in an article in Forbes by Nick Sobilla called "New Bill Would Abolish Qualified Immunity, Make It Easier to Sue Cops Who Violate Civil Rights." This is a good start. The best thing we can do right now is to clear our heads so we can implement policy that isn't driven by emotion. There's no perfect solution to solve this problem and eliminate racism by tomorrow. All policy has some trade-offs, but if we let our emotions dictate what our next steps must be, then we will end up with more risk for less reward. We must state our goals clearly and think through some of the externalities a mass change in policing practices would bring. If our goal is to decrease police presence to reduce the chances of police misconduct, we will exchange police force for poorer public safety outcomes. Rendering law enforcement useless will not protect the community from violence. On the other hand, giving law enforcement absolute power with little accountability will result in an oppressive force against the citizens it's meant to protect. There is a balance, and we must find it. I used to believe that we must achieve a society that is colorblind. If we don't see color, then we only see the individual. I've now changed that belief, or at least in the way I would define that goal. Our goal as a society is not to achieve color blindness. As long as we can see, we will see color. We can't avoid it. People are also proud of their heritage, and they see that reflected in the appearance in the mirror. Color blindness is a goal in that we treat everyone as an individual, but maybe it's not the best way to describe this type of progress. Sam Harris, someone whom I respect but mostly disagree with, but not in this, says it best, and I will paraphrase how he says it in my own words. We will only get past racism when we find race such an uninteresting characteristic that we do not find the need to apply that descriptor to anyone. It will be like having blonde hair. We see it, but we don't make character assumptions based on someone's hair color. The problem is ideas like white privilege, whiteness, blackness, black and brown bodies, and other terms that rely on race-based arguments are roadblocks in achieving a future with little to no racism. We all must agree as individuals who care about real progress that we must not devolve into these shallow ways of thinking. Creating a better future, as always, is a group effort. This concludes this current events podcast on finding a path towards justice. And as I said at the beginning of the show, I want to take a quick moment and share some different ways you can help support this content. There are a few easy ways to do this. You can follow me on Twitter at ENG_politics. You can join the Facebook group named Engineering Politics, where I share and discuss content with the Facebook community. You can also subscribe to my video channel on YouTube under the channel name Engineering Politics, where I'm making videos using this podcast audio laid over different graphics to create a better overall podcast experience. I'm also active on ThinkSpot, which is a discourse-generating application that promotes intelligent and honest conversations while discouraging the trolling and nonsense found on most social media platforms. You can find all of my podcasts and videos on there as well. But the best way to interact with me, get my newest content, and support this podcast is the Engineering Politics Locals community. I talked a bit about this at the beginning of the podcast. This is an amazing community that goes far beyond just a membership platform intermediary for creators. It allows the followers of this content to get together and discuss the newest articles, podcasts, and videos in one place. I strongly urge you to join the Engineering Politics Locals community at engineeringpolitics.locals.com. You can become a member for free, and now you can get a 3-month free trial when becoming a premium supporter if you use the promo code EPFREE. That's spelled EPFREE, no spaces. I would love to have your support with your subscription so this content can remain independent and keep growing. Monthly subscriptions to the Engineering Politics Locals community after the trial period start as low as $2 per month. I hope I can count on your support so I can start making higher quality podcasts and eventually live videos. I appreciate your consideration. Let's build a community together. Thanks for listening. This is the Engineering Politics Podcast.
None of the persons, podcasts, books, or other references other than engineering politics used in this work directly reflect my ideas and/or personal beliefs, nor should they be held accountable for anything said during this podcast. Thank you for listening.